Hello everybody, Mr. Ong here. Welcome to today's video in which I will recap Chapter 4, Reasons for the Outbreak of World War II in Europe. I will be doing this in the form of a mind map, okay? And this is an intentional strategy because I want to expose you guys to a way that you can revise for your exams, because this is a very powerful way. Mind maps are a very powerful way for students to help to see the connection between ideas, between the main points of ideas, the examples you can give in your exam, and the details or elaboration. Okay, but bear in mind that a mind map is merely a summary. It's not meant to be comprehensive. It's not meant to replace your textbook. It's not meant to replace your notes. Okay, it's just to give you guys the big idea, the big picture perspective on the topic. Now, so what should you do for this lesson? In this lesson, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys the skeleton or the main structure in which you guys can understand the whole chapter, see the bird's eye view. I'm going to give you guys some keywords and terms that are relevant to each point in the chapter. For you guys, how you guys can revise using the mind map is to add on your elaboration, add on your detail, add on things that will help you to understand the individual points and terms that are listed there. Okay, what you'll need for this lesson are the following materials. First one is the handout on the weakness of the League of Nations, the handout on Hitler's expansionist policies, and of course your textbook. Okay, Mr. Ong's not going to leave you in the lurch. For this one, the weakness of the League of Nations, I've already given you guys a sample mind map. I'm going to explain a little bit about the different things that you will see inside the mind map, just so you guys get a picture of how you can do your own mind maps in the future. Okay, I will be talking through or giving you guys a brief overview on Hitler's expansionist policies, and finally the textbook. Well, that's just for your revision. Okay, with that in mind, let's dive right into it. Let's look at the sample on the first section. How did the weakness of the League of Nations contribute to World War II? Remember that this chapter is divided into three portions. The first portion is the weakness of the League of Nations. Second section is going to be on Hitler's expansionist policy, and the third section is on the appeasement policy. Now, let's start off with the weakness of the League of Nations. We should recall that the League of Nations, it was an organization formed after World War I. Okay, it was intended to prevent the reoccurrence of war. Okay, remember that World War I, or what they will call the Great War, was a horrible period of devastation, and people realized that if we keep going on like this, if we keep on fighting between nations, then it's going to be a very big problem. So they created the League of Nations to stop it. Okay. However, sadly enough, the League of Nations ultimately failed in its aims to disarm, to organize disarmament conferences in the world. And it also failed in its aims to practice collective security. Okay, so when we look at this mind map, you might be thinking, okay, I seem to recall a little bit about disarmament, but am I able to provide some detail? Am I able to describe how does disarmament work to prevent war, which is ultimately the League of Nations aims, right? So we start off with the definition. What does disarmament mean? Disarmament means reducing the arms and weapons in the world. How does this prevent war? Well, if you decrease the ability of countries to wage war because they don't have tanks, don't have planes, then in the end, you reduce the possibility of war. Now, so this is the big point on disarmament. Unfortunately, it failed, and in your essays, you will need to be able to provide examples of failure. So over here, I've provided two examples. The first example is on the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. The second one is on the World Disarmament Conference in 1932. So in each of these examples, what you will need is to provide one or two sentences of detail that show the examiner, that show an understanding of how this example shows the failure of disarmament. For example, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, what was this pact about? It was an agreement between countries of all the world to resolve conflicts through peaceful means. I mean, this sounds very nice in principle, right? Like, okay, let's talk it out, let's negotiate. But the problem is, there's no way to enforce this pact, right? What are you going to do when people actually end up fighting? And because there's no clear way to enforce this pact, that this conference ultimately ended up in a failure. Okay. Similarly, in World Disarmament Conference, remember, you need to provide some details about what happened at the conference. Okay, so Germany demanded that the other powers like Britain and France and Russia disarm to the same power that Germany was expected to disarm to. They were unwilling to disarm. Germany says, that's not fair. Germany withdraws from the conference. Okay, and ultimately, you guys need to be able to answer how does this contribute to World War II. Okay, so you need to be able to say something like powerful countries still had a military capability for war because they didn't disarm, and the League of Nations, because now everybody still had the same amount of weapons that they started off with, could not stop them from engaging in conflicts, and they were not willing to use peaceful means. Okay, so that is on the point of the failure of disarmament. The failure of collective security, we studied a case study, an example in the Abyssinian crisis. You're going to see another example on the Manchurian crisis when we study the outbreak of war in Asia Pacific. For this crisis, you need to be able to give some details of the crisis. Remember, we watched a video in class about the crisis, and you need to be able to explain why, despite the fact that Italy, a major member of the League of Nations, having flouted the rules, having went against the rules, was not confronted by Britain and France. In fact, Britain and France tries to cut a deal called the Hall-Laval Pact, in which they said, you know what, I'm going to give you 2/3 of Abyssinia, just promise me you'll stop invading the rest of it. Okay, reason why? Because they were allies with Italy under the Stresa Front, and they wanted to stop Hitler. You'll notice that Mr. Ong, when he's giving these examples and details, he's using key historical details, talking about the Stresa Front, talking about the Hall-Laval Pact. How did this contribute to World War II? Well, you need to say that the League of Nations' failure to practice collective security made Mussolini and Hitler bolder, and it in fact pushed them into an alliance called the Rome-Berlin Axis. And also, Britain and France, they realized, we're not going to rely on the League. This doesn't seem like a very worthwhile organization. They're instead going to follow a policy of appeasement. Okay, so you start to see, in one mind map, you're able to recap the main points of the chapter. Okay? And the main points of the chapter, you probably realize that it's all talking about the same themes on why was the League of Nations weak. There were several main reasons. This was the topic of chapter 1. I'm not going to go into that. Okay? So this is an example of a mind map that you guys can produce, and how you can actually add on detail to this is to add more elaboration. Okay? So let's move on to your actual work. And on this one, we're going to be talking about Hitler's expansionist policies. This is the second section of your chapter. To properly understand this chapter, because you realize that you're going to be seeing a whole whirlwind of different events taking place, you need to start with what Hitler's expansionist aims were. What did he aim to do the moment he came into power in 1933? He had three main aims. He wanted to abolish the Treaty of Versailles. It means he wanted to get rid of the Treaty of Versailles. He wanted to establish the Greater Germany. This meant that all of the ethnic Germans, the German-speaking people who had been spread out all across Europe, he wanted to put everybody in the same territory. Well, accordingly, if you are going to unite all of the ethnic Germans in one territory, you're going to need a lot of space for it, and it's called Lebensraum. He wants to create Lebensraum, living space, and this involved conquering the rest of Europe, looking at countries like France, and looking in the West, and looking at countries like the Soviet Union in the East. So Hitler had a bunch of expansionist aims. He wants to expand his territory, and he's going to do that progressively after coming to power. And this is going to set him up and going to lead to or contribute to war. And for this chapter, you must be able to see the pattern. Okay, the pattern is always going to be the same. It's going to start off with Hitler taking some actions of aggression and expansion. Okay, he is going to flout. He's going to go against the rules of the Treaty of Versailles, and it's going to lead to a reaction by the Allied powers like Britain and France. But instead of confronting Hitler, instead of challenging Hitler and holding him accountable to the rules, they're going to appease him. They're going to try to avoid war at all costs. And ultimately, it leads to the outcome. Okay, so first thing, action. Second thing, reaction. Third thing, outcome. Hitler's always going to be convinced that the League of Nations and the Western powers like Britain and France, they're going to be weak. And he's going to become emboldened. He's going to become more and more aggressive. And as a result of his expansion, Germany is going to get more territories, more resources, and get stronger as a result. This is only going to encourage him to pursue war. Okay, so with this big picture in mind, let's zoom in. So we start off in 1933, we mentioned it earlier. He withdraws from the League of Nations and from the World Disarmament Conference. Okay? He uses the excuse that the other countries were not willing to disarm, and then he leaves the League of Nations. So what are the details you need to tell me? You need to know that now he's not restricted by the rules of the League of Nations. Okay, and as a result, he can begin to abolish the Treaty of Versailles. Because he doesn't have to follow the rules anymore, he can abolish the Treaty of Versailles, and he's going to start off with rearmament. We have seen this in the rearmament. We saw this under the chapter Social Impact of Hitler. So in 1933, he begins his secret program of conscription and rearmament. He only declares it publicly to the world in 1935. For this one, the key points and key details that you guys should be able to add on. What did the terms of the Treaty of Versailles originally state or originally allow the German army or German military to possess? For example, Treaty of Versailles says something along the lines of the armed forces can only have 100,000 men, they weren't allowed to have an air force. Okay, so include some of the details about the Treaty of Versailles versus how big was the Germany's military by 1935. Okay, you should recall from the lesson that by 1935 it had about 300,000 men, about 2,500 aircraft. Okay, and all of this was ongoing. Hitler was taking these actions, but the rest of the world, while they merely condemned him, they scolded him, but they didn't do anything serious to stop him. As a result, the outcome was he gets to build his military force. Okay, military force. And the first big action that he's going to take is in 1936, where he remilitarizes the Rhineland. Recall that from the Treaty of Versailles, the Rhineland was supposed to be a buffer zone between Germany and France, and it was supposed to be demilitarized, meaning Germany was not allowed to put its soldiers there. This was supposed to be a security buffer for the French, who had been invaded so many times in the past by Germany. Now, what does Hitler do? Hitler starts to aggressively send in his troops into the Rhineland as a way of testing the Allies. He wants to see, are they willing to stop him? Are they willing to hold him accountable to the Treaty of Versailles? Well, we recall that when the French security forces saw the German soldiers coming in, they withdrew, they didn't challenge him, and Hitler eventually succeeds in remilitarizing the Rhineland. Now, what was the result of this success? Okay, the result was Hitler becomes convinced, he becomes emboldened, he becomes convinced that the Allies aren't going to stop him, and all he has to do is just push hard enough and enforce his will, and he'll get what he wants. Okay, that happened in 1936 because the rest of the world, the League of Nations, was being distracted by the Abyssinian crisis, which was ongoing at the same point of time. Okay, in 1937, remember that there was a civil war. That means an internal conflict between the nationalists and the communists. These two groups in Spain that were fighting for control. What does Hitler do? This guy very capo. He decides to send his military to fight the communists in the civil war. Now, why on earth would Hitler suddenly just send his forces into a conflict where his soldiers might potentially lose their lives? The idea here was he gets to try out his battle strategies. He gets to give his army and his air force valuable combat experience. Once again, this was obviously not allowed according to the League of Nations, but nobody's going to stop him. As a result, what was the outcome? The German armed forces becomes stronger. Okay, gets stronger. And by the late 1930s, Germany's armed forces is going to be the strongest military unit in the whole of Europe. Okay, so these first four cards, we start to see that Germany is starting to expand. Britain and France are not going to stop him, they're going to appease him, and it's going to embolden Hitler. Now, let's look at what happens in 1938, where there's going to be an Anschluss with Austria. Remember, Anschluss means unification. Okay, according to the Treaty of Versailles, it was not allowed. Okay, they were not allowed to unite Germany and Austria. However, Hitler's going to start to stir up trouble. He's going to ask the Nazis, who were Nazi supporters in Austria, to protest, to demonstrate, to complain to the government that they were being oppressed or they were being bullied. And as a result, Germany and Hitler will say, you know what, we need to put this to a vote. Ask the Austrians, do they want to unite with Germany? If so, then we should just unite. Obviously, this was not allowed by the Treaty of Versailles, but ultimately, the results of the votes were quite convincing. 99.75% of Austrians decided to vote to join Germany. Now, how does this contribute to war? On the big picture, he does two things. The first thing is Germany gains access to Austria's army and resources. What kind of resources? Remember, things like gold, things like iron. Okay. Second thing is, it once again convinces Hitler that, you know what, he can go on flouting and getting rid of the Treaty of Versailles. Nobody's going to stop him. So his big next move is in 1938 with the Munich or Sudetenland crisis. Okay, these terms can be used interchangeably. Sudetenland doesn't mean they're the same area. Okay, Sudetenland crisis. Okay, Sudetenland, we must remember, is a small stretch of area that was in Czechoslovakia. This country, Czechoslovakia. Remember how to spell this. Okay, so he's going to say that in the Sudetenland, it was an area where there were plenty of ethnic Germans. He once again claims that the ethnic Germans were being bullied. They start to protest, and he says, you know what, there's a crisis. I, as the leader of Germany, I have to protect the Germans. So he threatens to invade Sudetenland, he threatens to invade Czechoslovakia, and this therefore sparks a crisis. Okay, we remember that for Czechoslovakia, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union had actually previously promised to defend Czechoslovakia against Germany. The Czechs themselves were willing to fight, and if you recall from the lessons, they had multiple fortifications, they had a strong army. Okay? However, instead of fighting, the Allies, being good for nothing, decide to have a Munich agreement. Okay, Munich is a place in Germany. Okay, and in this place, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy gathered together to negotiate a peace deal. Essentially, what they said was, Hitler, you can go ahead, take the Sudetenland, but promise me that you're not going to continue to invade Czechoslovakia. Okay, Hitler signs on a piece of paper saying that, yep, he'll take the Sudetenland. That's the last thing he'll take. He's not going to take the rest of Czechoslovakia. Noticeably absent from the Munich agreement were the Czechs. So there were no Czechs at this meeting. There were no Soviets as well. Now, where have we seen this before? Okay, we have seen this before in the Abyssinian crisis, in which the Britain and France were willing to send away 2/3 of Abyssinia to Italy, to the aggressor, without the permission of the victim. In the same way, the Czechs here were not being consulted, but Britain and France were willing to give the Sudetenland away to the aggressor, Germany. Okay. At this point, however, after signing the Munich agreement, Chamberlain comes back, he says that it's peace in our time, he's very happy, but next thing you know, Hitler's going to continue to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. At this point, they finally realize, maybe we can't trust this Hitler fellow, and probably the next target of Hitler is Poland, and this time, Britain and France, once again, they promise to defend Poland. They said if Germany or if Hitler were to attack Poland, they are going to come to Poland's defense. Now, we have seen what value or how little value Britain and France's promises were, because every time they promise to defend someone in the past, they failed to deliver on that promise. So we can expect that Hitler is going to think, all I gotta do is push on, aggressively expand, they're going to fall to my will again. Okay, but how is Hitler going to invade Poland? Remember that to the east of Poland is this big Soviet Union, the communists, and Hitler is very afraid that if he invades Poland, he might end up in a war with the Soviet Union, and he won't be able to go back into the west to attack countries like France. So, in order to allow him to invade Poland, Hitler strikes a deal with Stalin, and he signs a non-aggression pact, meaning that they're not going to attack each other. Inside this pact, they also agreed to divide Poland up between Germany and the Soviet Union, and in so doing, Hitler avoids two-front war, meaning he can focus on clearing out France and Britain in the west of Europe and doesn't have to worry about fighting the Soviet Union in the east. Okay, at no point should we think that just because they signed a deal means that these guys like each other, that Hitler is suddenly in love with communism. But no, this is a marriage of convenience. It's just a temporary deal. At least that's what Hitler realizes. Okay, so with this Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact signed in 1939, this allows him to finally invade Poland. So Germany invades Poland in September 1939, invades Poland. This time, Britain and France, they finally honor their word. They're gonna defend Poland by declaring war. Okay, sorry. Britain and France, they declare war on Germany. Thereafter, this officially starts World War II in Europe. Officially starts World War II in Europe. Okay, so I hope that you guys can benefit from this mind map. You'll start to see in the middle, once again, we start off talking about how did Hitler's expansionist policies contribute to World War II. We talked about his expansionist aims. We talked about the pattern of action, reaction, and outcomes, and how this finally leads to contributes to World War II. And we looked at 8 separate incidences. Okay, hopefully this was a useful lesson for you guys. Thank you.